Hi, everybody. So excited to talk about temperament and sleep today. It is my passion. So let's just get started because I have a lot to say. So the title of my talk is How Temperament Affects Sleep and Everything Else, because that is just so true. So how did I get here? Well, I got here because I had one of these little ones. My daughter was born, she's 26 now, after 27 long hours of natural labor. And I remember the first time they wheeled her into me, and her eyes were like laser beams. They were like this. I mean, she was lying in the little bassinet, and she was like this. And I remember thinking, brand new mom, that's not normal, is it? Are babies supposed to do that? That was just one of the first times I said, is that normal? I knew something was up right away. I mean, she was just really alert. And she also wasn't at all that sleepy newborn that you usually imagine who sleeps all day long. She never wanted to sleep, ever. And I remember the day when she was around 2 months old. My memory's a little foggy. She was around 2 months old, and I remember sitting with her and doing kind of face-to-face time. And then she seemed a little cranky, so I get up and walk her around our little apartment, looking at things. Look at the picture, look in the mirror, look out the window, then look at a couple other things, then go sit down. And she would want to be back up again. And I thought, is it possible for a 2-month-old to be bored? But she kind of was. And I do have to say that temperament that I saw right from moment one was exactly who she was, exactly who she still is to this day. So that sort of got me started on my journey about looking at temperament. The sleep part, of course, came naturally because she just never slept ever, ever, ever. And I knew at the time that crying it out was not going to work. I knew, number one, I couldn't do it physiologically, philosophically. I knew it, I couldn't do it. But second, I also knew that even if I wanted to, she would cry for hours and never give up, ever, ever. And we would just probably be a wreck, more than we were. And that was no picnic either. So at that time, it was like cry it out or gut it out. I was doing attachment parenting. We were co-sleeping. I was trying to follow her cues, and still it was just a rodeo. So to this day, I pretty much can't recommend with one of these kids just gutting it out, because there were lots of days I was not a good mom. I remember thinking, is this better? Is the way I am today better than doing a few nights of crying it out? Is it better? And I never, I validate my own decision, but the jury's still a little bit out. It was really rough. So hopefully what we'll talk about today is sort of a middle ground and how to work on sleep while taking temperament and parents' bandwidth into account. Because guess what? Sensitive, intense babies almost always have sensitive, intense parents. Go figure, right? So let's get going. So the big idea today is my hypothesis that I believe that temperament may be the dividing line between kiddos who sleep and kiddos who don't. I think that I know that most research and advice that's out there is really written for and based on kiddos who are pretty, I don't want to say mellow, like they're not always easygoing, but they're adaptable. They will eventually get with the program without a lot of effort. It's a whole different ballgame, people, when instead of crying for 15 minutes at bedtime, your little one cries for 2 solid hours for a solid week. We're talking about 2 completely different contexts here, and the latter is what most people with these alert, intense babies are experiencing. So they come to sleep coaches saying, I've tried everything and it has not worked. And that's because all of the books were written with different kids in mind. So almost 100% of research, it's true, does not take temperament into account at all. So we really don't know anything about the samples that are in research. We don't know if there were any intense kids in there. It's estimated that they say the research says about 10% of kids can be classified as what they would call difficult. And I'm going to use big air quotes here because I don't like that term. But difficult usually refers to unsettled, fussy, reactive, kind of intense. That number, that 10% number is from quite a while ago. I think chances are that the number has gone up. I certainly think that it's probably closer to 25 to 30% of kiddos can be classified as this more sensitive, more intense, alert subgroup of temperament. And we know very little about those kids and sleep. We know that those kids have more problems with sleep, but we don't know whether the sleep advice and sleep research on interventions has taken temperament into account. I know of one study that said that they did assess temperament, and that children, the babies with a more difficult temperament, did improve a little, but they improved a lot less than kids who weren't classified as difficult. It certainly didn't work the same. So what are we talking about? When I'm saying intense, alert, what are we talking about? This is what you might hear from parents. This is, I have to say, pretty consistent. Not all parents will say all things. So the one thing we're going to be talking about is that this is a package of traits. And some kids may have a lot of one and none of another. They may have way more sensitivity, but they're not quite as outwardly intense. That's okay. What we're really talking about is kids who are a little more towards the tails of the bell curve when it comes to temperament. So parents will say, oh, she has big feelings, or oh my God, if I don't get to her really quick, she'll 0 to 60 in terms of her intensity. She gets really worked up very fast. Most parents will say these kids are not self-soothers, that they just can't calm down on their own, which makes sense. And we'll talk about why. Doesn't miss a thing. Like that kiddo notices every little thing, even as a small infant. It can be true. Doesn't miss a thing. Super sensitive, like little things bother them. As infants, this may be a little trickier to assess, but these are kids that react strongly to things like loud noises, or get very distracted by lights or sounds, or different little subtle things can not just bother them, but they notice them. It gets to them. I love this one because this is, for me, it's like a keyword. The minute a parent says this, I'm like, okay, that's all I need to know. They will say, it's like he has FOMO, like he's just afraid to go to sleep because he'll miss something. The minute, if a parent ever says to you, it's like my baby has FOMO, 100% we know what we're dealing with. These little ones want to be awake. They want to be engaged in the world, which has amazing upsides. It also has some real challenges in there. Can't be put down. So these little guys, parents will say, will not play by himself. Really wants me all the time. They call them like Velcro babies. It has to be with me. Again, what we're going to be talking about is that there are serious upsides in there, as well as the challenges that go along with that. Oh boy, transitions just can't turn on a dime at all. Transitions like awake to asleep to awake, or changing clothes, changing diapers, going somewhere, all those things can be really difficult. Energizer Bunny just goes and goes and goes and goes. Some of these kids are very physically active. Not all of them, but some of them, that's in the package as well. And of course, never, ever, ever sleeps. While there are behavioral pieces of never, ever sleeps, there's a quality to this with these kids that's kind of important, just in terms of like, there's sort of normative waking, what we would expect, or even the upper end of normal for waking. And these kids are above that. Like they really seem to resist sleep with all they've got. Here's some other giveaways. This is another one of my little Livewires. Bouncing on a ball. These little guys appear, and I have ideas about why, but almost always they're the ones that need to be bounced pretty vigorously in order to get to sleep. Often parents will say they haven't slept well since birth. So like I said, even in that newborn fuzzy sleeps all the time period, these little ones are not like that. She naps for 30 minutes on the dot. Yeah, that's another giveaway. I get them totally asleep, and the minute they hit the crib, they are awake, and I have to start all over again. Yeah, always a clue for me. And right from birth, that early alertness, his eyes were wide open. I hear this quite a bit from parents. So I call these kids Livewires. Just because they're kind of on. They have current going through them all the time. They just seem a little bit more mentally, physically, emotionally active, and they have a lot more coursing through their system that they, number one, have to manage, right? And also that can kind of fry their system. So the idea of electrical current really will make sense as we go along. Here's a chart of all the different conceptualizations of this kind of temperament, or different constellations of these temperament traits. And I wanted to show where things overlap. So we have different columns. There's a book called The Difficult Child by Stanley Turecki. Mary Kurchinka is, of course, her seminal Spirited Child work, and now she has Spirited Babies. There's some overlap with giftedness, or what we call overexcitabilities. This is a theorist, last name is Dabrowski. It's a different way of looking at intelligence, which is not just IQ, but heightened abilities in like creativity, thinking, feeling, perceiving. A lot of overlap with what we're talking about here. Dr. Sears' high needs and fussy baby. We'll go through some of these in a minute. Rothbart, this is unsettled, irritable, is what the researchers really are looking at. They tend to look at a whole different set of traits and characteristics. I'm not going to talk a lot about what those are today, partly because for me they don't map super well to what we're going to be discussing. Linda Budd has a construction called active alert children. Elaine Ahrens, highly sensitive child. This is in the mix as well. And then Thomas and Chess, that's the sort of original seminal temperament researchers. They came out with sort of 7 areas that even like Mary Kurchinka really tracks those. Those are kind of the original ones. So we can see that like these bars show an amazing overlap, of course, with intensity and soothability. Oh, I should have colored that one orange. Thomas and Chess also has intensity. I think Elaine Ahrens' work, she would probably, if you ask her, she would probably talk about intensity. But often what people think of as intensity is kind of that outward, fussy and loud, tantrumy, meltdowny intensity. I think if you asked her, she would say these kids are intense just in a different way. So my hunch is that bar would go all the way across. Sensory sensitivity is huge as well in all of these packages, in research and in these constructions for other people. A low sensory threshold is pretty emblematic. Also persistence, the ability to persist in a goal. Sometimes we'll see distractibility. This is a bit of a mixed bag. Like, is your child really distractible? Can they be distracted from something they want? I left distractibility out because it's, like I said, it's got some different definitions that can be confusing. High activity level is here, spirited. It's also in giftedness. It's in active alert. It's in Thomas and Chess. Not all kiddos are really highly active, but a lot of them are. I love this one, engagement and interaction. That goes with high needs. Even the temperament researchers and active alert, they want to be with you, on you, near you, engaging with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about a survey that I did, but just to give you a heads up, I actually found that engagement was just as predictive of sleep problems as intensity and sensory sensitivity. So kiddos who really wanted to be in relationship with their parents, interacting with them, had more problems with sleep. Interesting. Perceptiveness is another one that goes through a lot of this. That doesn't miss a thing. Empathy. So once we start seeing these kiddos who were little live wires, like babies, and they start getting older and you can really start seeing who they are and what they're interested in, what they're concerned about, you start seeing, or you can start seeing a higher level of sense of justice, empathy, ethics. They think about social dynamics very deeply and are affected by them. So these are kiddos that can be really impacted when they go to school and they start experiencing social dynamics. Trouble with transition, so unadaptable is in a few of these. Irregularity. Parents will also sometimes say, it doesn't happen a lot, but they'll sometimes say every day is different. Something will work for 3 days and after 3 days it doesn't work anymore. Or what worked last night doesn't work tonight. A lack of a real pattern to these kiddos is part of the package. There's something called first reaction or approach. Now this is kind of delineates two groups of kids, I think. There are some that just go headlong toward experience. They're all in. They're there. They're ready to take on the world. That's one direction. The other direction is sort of initially cautious. Thomas and Chess would have called this slow to warm up. Those are the kids that like to hang back. That's more the highly sensitive kid too. Likes to hang back, figure things out, test the waters, observe, and then jump in. Again, these are two different directions from the same point. It's just a slightly different manifestation. Again, introvert, extrovert. Now, here's some that didn't get these ones in white are specific to that one category. So, of course, giftedness is going to be, these kids can be very verbal, very early readers, early visual alertness, like we talked about, great memory, precocious humor, high ethical. I mean, I could have put ethics up there with empathy. They just think about more. High needs. Now, Sears is looking at babies, and you'll see here, he tends to talk about it. I think these are more about the challenges of these kids. So sleep problems, parents will say they can be draining, unable to be put down, which probably could be up here with engagement. Not cuddly, separation sensitive, feeds frequently. The active, alert, bright, controlling, fluctuating self-esteem performers. So this is just another way of looking at these kids. Highly sensitive. These are kiddos. Again, a lot of times this gets misconstrued only to be the quiet ones. Again, you can have a kid who's really more out there who is definitely still highly sensitive. I think the overlap with highly sensitive is huge. So those are all the different constructions. Like I said, I'm using the word Livewire just to mean a little more on. And again, it's intensity, alertness, perceptiveness, persistence, sensory sensitivity are the things that we see most and are often the most predictive of sleep problems. So we'll see that some of what I said does map to these traits, right? So not a self-soother, big feelings has to do with intensity. I think these kiddos are not self-soothers because they just have more to manage. Right? So if you give one person a 10-pound bag of flour to hold, that's no big deal. But if you give them a 100-pound bag of cement, they're not going to be able to hold it because it's more weight. I think these kiddos have bigger, faster reactions, and therefore it usually blows out their capacity to self-soothe. So they need help. Doesn't miss a thing is perceptiveness, low sensory threshold, engaged, interactive, persistent, change averse, so true, and active. These are going to be mostly the traits that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so where does it come from? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but generally it's hardwired. Kiddos come into the world with this kind of wiring. There's it's a detection system that takes in stimuli from outside and processes it, and has a reaction to it, processes it. A lot of times this stuff can be seen from birth and even in utero. There's a great book called The Orchid and the Dandelion by Thomas Boyce. And you might be really interested, but it's the sort of biological underpinnings of temperament. And he found that some of these children had characteristics in utero. They were more reactive to loud noise, or they were more physically active in utero. So they kind of tend to come into the world wired a certain way. The idea of orchids and dandelions, the concept, and why we're talking about flowers, is the idea is that dandelions are pretty hardy. They can do pretty well just about anywhere, and really well in your lawn. They do great in the lawn. No, but they do pretty well anywhere. Orchids, on the other hand, need a very specific set of conditions, right? They need just the right temperature, just the right amount of water, just the right amount of light, or else they don't do well. But if they get that, they do incredibly well. So the technical term for this is, and I put it on the bottom, is differential susceptibility to context. And what that means is that orchid children are more responsive to negative parenting, negative caregiving environments. So if you have a dandelion kid and an orchid kid in a not super great environment, the dandelion kid will probably do okay. They're not going to be unscathed, but they're generally going to be able to cope. The orchid child will react much more strongly to a negative caregiving environment. Vantage sensitivity is the exciting term for me. This is Jay Belsky and Michael Plus. They said it's not only do they do worse in poor environments, they actually do way better in good environments. So they respond more strongly in both directions. So if you can give them a good environment, it takes more out of you for sure, but orchid kids will really, really do well. So the research on temperament, there's that group of research, the orchid and dandelion research, is coming really out of developmental biologists. It's coming out of a certain field. Research on temperament that's coming from the psychology field, in my opinion, is overemphasizes the risks that are involved in having a difficult temperament. And actually, almost all the terms are quite negative. Difficult, unsettled, irritable, fussy. It's all really focused on the challenges and risks. And so the research shows that a difficult temperament in infancy is related to all kinds of terrible outcomes. I mean, it's quite depressing. It also has bad outcomes for parents. There's higher rates of depression, reduced self-efficacy, reduced pleasure in parenting, marital stress. I mean, it's all kind of bleak, I have to say. But the question is, at what point do things get bad, right? Is it the temperament that's related to these outcomes, or is something else going on that can precipitate negative outcomes? Is it a two-way street? So here's what we know. I mean, my theory, my idea, my experience, goodness knows, is that having a really intense, unsettled baby, tiny one, where you have all these images of how it's going to be, and it is not like that at all, throws parents way off their center. It really knocks them down. They are unprepared for this level of parenting. And for some parents, they never quite get back up on their feet. So yes, if you have a difficult baby and we don't give parents any preparation or support for what they can do, parents, number one, internalize the problem. I've screwed it up. I suck at this. But they also can be incredibly exhausted. And then you may have a cascade of problems that then end up with some negative outcomes, negative impacts on the parents. But the fault here is not with the parent. It's with the lack of support and lack of information for the reality of having one of these children. So the current advice, I mean, really doesn't even talk about them. And I have to say, a lot of the sleep advice, most of the sleep books, super cut and dry. You have this baby, you do A, B, and C, and your baby sleeps through the night. And then when parents try that, they do A, B, and C, and it's not a few minutes of fussing over 3 nights, but hours of screaming, hysterical child, sweaty, exhausted parent, and nothing changes, and they get to the other end and sleep isn't any better, they don't have the opportunity to point the finger at the advice and say, that doesn't work for this child. They point it at themselves, because I would say a lot of the advice does that as well. If this doesn't work, you're doing it wrong. So these parents are really left out in the cold. So advice is not equipping them or even talking about them. And by the time, at least as a sleep coach, by the time these parents get to me, I say they're ground down to a powder. They are so exhausted and so desperate and so bedraggled, right? And hopeless, because they think it's all been their fault, and they are so tired. So what we're going to talk about today is really how to work on sleep with the child, but we really have to take care of the parents, and we really have to honor the difficult path that they're on. They're sort of in this all too. So I was curious about a couple of things. One is, the research all talks about all these negative impacts of having an intense child. But my experience, and I think the experience of most parents, is there's good stuff in there too. So I really wanted to see what the rates of kind of upsides were. I also wanted to see if it was true that parents of more intense children, Livewires, were struggling more with sleep, and if they were finding success with the existing sleep training interventions. So it was a lot. It was a big survey. I got 850 surveys back, so it's a really good sample size. Limitation was it's of course, very skewed towards white, upper middle class or upper class, and highly educated. I think it was 82% white. So it was an internet sample. So take that into account when we're thinking about this. So I found, interestingly, I was also testing out some sort of anecdotal things. Often people who have these kids had a difficult labor or birth, or the child had colic. There just seems, we don't know why, but anecdotally there was some connection between those two things. So I wanted to test that out. And sure enough, I found that temperament definitely, temperament definitely was related to a parent report of a difficult labor and or birth. Kids were more likely, more intense kids were more likely to have or have had colic, silent reflux, apnea, food intolerances, more ear infections, and they also had a greater number of those events. So sort of this idea that these kids are a little more sensitive from the get-go. The one that didn't come out significant that I was surprised about was eczema, because I also see a lot of kids with eczema, but that did not come out as a significant difference. When I asked about parents and how they were doing, parents of more intense kids were significantly more emotionally exhausted, more physically exhausted. They were more likely to report that they thought they might have had postpartum depression in the first year. And this was the thing that broke my heart. They had significantly lower ratings of their own competence as parents. That's the one that really got me, because I think these parents are working much, much harder, and they feel much, much worse about it. If you think about a parent who had, let's say they had a long labor and or a hard birth, something happened, emergency C-section, just a really difficult labor, and any of that stuff that can cause a bumpy road, baby had to be in the NICU for a few days, any of that. Then you get them home and they have colic, they're crying inconsolably, or they have feeding problems or latch problems, or they're, it's like already the parents are trying to catch up because there's a lot of things to manage. They also have to deal with the fact that this is not at all like any of the images of the parenting that they've ever seen. I always remember thinking of those like Pampers ads where the mom was sitting peacefully with a newborn sleeping on her shoulder and the sun was streaming in and it was so beautiful and peaceful. And like that was just like not even remotely like my experience at all. And so parents are kind of like, what happened? This isn't like I expected it to be. These children are also not like any other children that they may know. If it's only 25% or less, there's usually only one in a group of people. I do, or back when we used to do in-person events, I would go and talk to, there are parent support groups here where I am in Seattle, and they would, parents of like 2, 3, 4-month-olds would get together and they'd have meetings over the first several months of their baby's life. And so it's generally 3-month-old babies that I would go talk to, their parents. And there would always be, the group of babies lying on their back on a blanket on the floor. Parents were sitting around them chatting, or some they were drinking wine or having a snack. And there would always be one standing in the back of the room doing this with a very fussy baby. And I always would think, I see you and I know what you're feeling right now, because you're wondering why your baby can't just lie peacefully on the floor, why you can't just take a moment to chat with other moms and have a snack. So these parents or the discussion in the group is, oh, well, my baby slept 6 solid hours last night, and maybe your baby slept 45 minutes at a time. Like, these parents really feel like oddballs in their peer group, in their parent groups. This child may not even be like the other kids in the family, the existing family, right? So that's another way that this really knocks parents off. Like I said, sleep interventions don't work. Nothing works like the books say they're going to. Sleep is also way worse than it should be for the age, like way worse, can be. And parents are made to feel like it's their fault. So if you just look at these factors, we're really talking about kind of a perfect storm for a parent that feels pretty much behind the 8 ball, and is just barely limping along. And it can get bleak. Parents may think, why am I doing this? This is not what I signed up for. Is this ever going to get better? I feel like I don't like being a parent. I think I suck at it. All that is in the mix. And before we go in and just try to fix sleep problems, we really have to honor parents and where they're coming from. They're kind of walking wounded. So the bright sides of temperament, Jay Belsky and Michael Plus, this vantage sensitivity, they actually said, hey, we think we're missing the upsides of this darker side of temperament, and they're 100% right. So in my survey, higher levels of temperamental difficulty were significantly predictive of higher levels of intensity and all this challenging stuff. However, I did find higher levels of perceptiveness, sensory sensitivity, persistence, and emotional sensitivity in slightly older kids. Now, a couple of these we can say, well, are those strengths? Like persistence. It's one of those things like, is that really a strength? Because it's really super hard. I always think about, like, look, when your child is 16 or 18 or off in college, we want them to be persistent. We want girls to be able to speak their minds. We want all kids to be able to fight for what they want. Not super convenient when they're little, but ultimately it's a really intense strength. So how does all of this impact sleep? Well, honestly, how does it not? It all impacts sleep. It impacts every single aspect of sleep and trying to get more. So we have to really break this down. I mean, what we just often think about, okay, we do X, Y, and Z, and then kids are asleep, or we do X, Y, and Z, and we're asleep. But let's really break it down into, like, how does sleep occur? First of all, you have to have the signal that you're sleepy. You have to feel tired, right? You get a feeling of, oh, I'm sleepy. Then you have to be able to have the ability to disconnect from the waking world, right? You're in bed, you get comfortable, so that's the right sensory environment. Then you have to be able to turn your attention away from the thoughts running in your head, which as adults, sometimes that's the hardest part. But basically, you let that sleep overtake you, and then you know how to get to sleep. That if you close your eyes and you relax your body and breathe deeply, you will go to sleep. Well, all of those steps can be super hard for a baby who is really alert, really engaged in the world, really sensory sensitive, and really doesn't have the skills to learn how to go to sleep. So here's the other problem, is that for dandelion kids, the pathway to sleep is that they don't have that far to go. They may feel really sleepy, they yawn, they rub their eyes, they may feel droopy, you can see them get droopy, and so sleep is like right over there. So when we talk about sleep training a dandelion kid, really they don't have that far to go. And that's why, for them, it may be, if you're actually doing sort of a actual sleep training, they may fuss and fight for 15 minutes, but then all that sleep stuff just overtakes them, and there they are. They're right over there at sleep. For orchid kids, Livewires, they have a lot farther to go. There's a lot more mountains to climb. There's a lot more obstacles in their way that they need to be able to address, and they might get sidetracked with all kinds of things. So that process of going to sleep is just way harder for them, and which is why they have more sleep problems. So for sleep, there's just so many moving parts for them, because instead of a mellower dandelion kid, they may not love the texture of their pajamas, but sleep is so much stronger, and it just balances out. Remember that for Livewire kids, everything is a big deal. Everything is a big deal. So I say it's kind of like the Princess and the Pea story, right? Like any little thing that's going to bother them is going to keep them awake and not able to sleep. So we don't just look at behavior. We don't just look at what the parent is doing, because that's only a part of it. The rest of it we also have to acknowledge. So the child's physiology, is there something physically going wrong that keeps this child from being able to relax into sleep? So we look at all the physiological things that can impact sleep: silent reflux, obstructed breathing, sensory sensitivity, so that if, the room is too quiet or too loud or too hot or too cold, that's the sensory threshold. That's where it overlaps. Lately, we've been seeing a lot of low ferritin, and I might talk about it later, but low ferritin is going to just tank sleep in the worst way. Food intolerances, all that physiology. Then we have to look at developmental capacity. What's normal for this age? How much can this age group tolerate in terms of distress, and then reduce that, because these little guys, their circuits get fried much more quickly and much more dramatically. How persistent are they? Are they developmentally able to distract themselves or self-soothe? Are they do they have some skills that they have at their disposal or not? And then what's their sensory threshold for sleep? So there's a lot of moving parts that and as a coach or anybody working with sleep, we really have to entertain all of that. And we also have to remember that all of that is within the circle of what parents can do. So working on sleep, finally, I know, took a while. So these cases are complex, like we said in that little Venn diagram. This is not a case of like, oh, you just have to. And in fact, if you go in with that, you're going to lose that parent, because you really have to know they've probably tried everything. I don't think I mentioned it, but, did I mention it? Sorry. Let me see what my next stop. Okay. In that sleep, in the survey on sleep, I found that parents of more intense kids had tried a greater number of interventions, and all with less success. So you can't go in assuming that parents have just missed something really obvious. I mean, maybe they've missed something obvious, or maybe they just don't know how these kids work. But Absolutely take a good solid amount of time and ask parents what they've already tried and what happened, because they're going to be on guard against a simple answer for sure. Okay, so how to begin? So first you have to know how much has to change. How far does this child have to go? Are you completely starting from scratch, like a kiddo who's always co-slept, always breastfed on demand? Now mom is on the ragged edge of exhaustion and the baby's 9 months old and it's time. Is it just bedtime? Is it bedtime and nighttime? Is it bedtime, nighttime, night weaning, and early, how far do you have to go? Asking what they've tried already and how it worked. When did they try it? How long did they try it for? What caused them to stop? Of course, rule out any physiological explanations. A few others that I didn't mention. I have had kiddos with low muscle tone, so pay attention to milestones if haven't met some of their motor milestones. I've also had kids with, I just had a client recently as a last resort, although after this it's not going to be a last resort, I recommended craniosacral because the child, she would say, well, it was, I think the baby was 7 months old. The baby could do things like roll over and push up, but just wasn't interested. She said she puts her on her tummy and she just lays there. She can do it, mom said, but she just doesn't want to. And I thought, well, that's a little interesting. So they went to craniosacral and the therapist said, well, I don't find anything huge. She did have some tightness. And like literally after that therapy session, that baby was doing all the stuff that she should have been doing. So we don't know. We don't know what kind of physiological things can be going on. But if there's anything physiological going on, these little guys will experience it profoundly. So those are important to pay attention to. Check the easy stuff first. We're going to talk about awake windows, and these little guys, they give terrible sleepy signals if they exist at all. They're terrible, they're invisible, or they're late. So I never trust sleepy signals with these little guys. My little one, I remember her being 10 months old, and I was following her cues, waiting for her to seem tired. And I literally watched David Letterman come on and go off. Now, David Letterman used to come on at like 11:30 at night. And I remember Northern Exposure came on at 12:30, and she was going strong. And I, again, thought, this isn't normal. Looking back, she probably had early sleepy signals or tired cues that were impossible to pick up on. So watch the clock. Check to make sure naps are on track as much as you can and that bedtime is on track. The most important thing is how much can parents handle? Because sometimes by the time they get to you, they are so tired that the minute you say, hey, it's going to get a little worse or a lot worse before it gets better, they can't do worse. They just don't have it. And then we have to really proceed with them in mind and go kind of a little more slowly than we might want to. So here's what parents really need to know from you. They need to know that whatever they've done up to this point is all good. They always say, "Oh God, I know we've started such bad habits, but I just didn't know." Like there's a lot of sort of self-criticism. You can absolutely say, "Look, these little guys are curveballs, and you did what you could do for this child in that moment. Everything you've done up till now is all good and makes sense." Seriously, I've seen parents end up doing some bonkers stuff by the time they get to me. One dad was walking with the baby on a treadmill. Other parents were reading 7 or 8 books at night. Kids having to hold mom's hair, or the child had to have their hand or their fingers inside the parent's mouth in order to go to sleep. Crazy gymnastics. Parents feel really almost shame about it. Absolutely validate that you did what you had to do to get that child to sleep, and now we're going to change it, and that's fine. They do know it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to be harder for a little bit, but that's okay. It's okay. figure out how much worse they can handle. And then we'll talk about how to break that into like little bite-sized pieces. I think a lot of times parents are sort of secretly hoping that you have an approach that the baby won't notice, that you can do something and change something without a lot of, pushback or a lot of crying. And I always have to gently say, we can't sneak up on them. They are going to notice, and they're going to tell you that they notice, and they're not going to like it. So just know that there's literally nothing we can change that they are not going to absolutely 100% pick up on. That just kind of dispels this. I think it's just really wishful thinking. If I could come up with something like that, I'd be in great shape. The other thing is that temperament really doesn't go away. These are skills that they're going to need for a lifetime. So the notion of setting some limits or telling, essentially saying to a baby, like, look, I can't keep doing all of this in order to get you to sleep. I physically can't do it. So now you need to bend a little bit and come toward me because I have to be able to function. This is not about saying to a baby, hey, my needs are more important than yours. But there's got to be with these children who require more from parents around the clock. We're not just talking about nighttime. Once that kid wakes up, it's a rodeo all day. So these parents need to have some energy, and they need to have a little bit of feeling of confidence, and asking a baby to adapt a little with a lot of support is really good. And I always say to these folks, look, you're going to have to get used to saying no or saying this is how we're going to do it, and be supportive and present while your kid says they don't like it, because you're going to need that skill later on. So repairing the damage. So that there is a part of this with intense little ones. Again, parents are coming to you kind of broken, and we need to shore parents up. So let them know that they haven't caused the problem. This is not their fault. They didn't create temperament. They have not created whatever they're seeing. Whatever they're seeing is coming from the child, and we're going to sort of learn how to understand that kid and understand the challenges, but also the strengths that are underneath that. So tell them that sleep books and parenting books were not written about their kid, so it's not surprising that it didn't work. And then highlight the bright sides they may not see. That was my other theory behind doing this survey, was that if parents knew, like, okay, this isn't just all bad, that my child is having a problem with this new way, they're being really persistent, but kind of good for them. I want them to be persistent later. Or, oh my God, they noticed that I did this thing. That perceptiveness is a huge strength. I mean, these little ones are taking in more information per unit of time. And when they're small, they just don't understand how to manage it. They're just overloaded with it. But I really think they have very hungry little brains, and the brains are working all the time. I think they're going to be smart, creative kids. And it's just that it's like a friend of mine talks about the difference between a Prius and a race car. But I'm like, this is like a race car engine in a little VW body. Like, this little kid does not know how to drive this engine. And so a lot of the stress and meltdowns and stuff is just because they don't know how to drive. They're a pretty powerful brain. So if a parent can have this idea of some upsides, I think it could potentially help them cope a little bit more. Really validate for them how hard this is, and that they are not the only ones with a child like this. They just may be the only ones in their friend group, but there are tons and tons and tons of parents in this same boat who all feel really ignored and left out by a lot of the parenting advice that's out there. These children do require and sort of demand a higher level of parenting skill, and you can let parents know that they are stepping up. They are ponying up to meet the higher bar that these guys set for parents. You really have to be on your game. For older kids, you have to be ahead of the game. It's not easy at all. It's no joke. And they're even if they don't feel like they're doing a good job, they are. They are doing a good job because this little kiddo is a force of nature, right? So, okay. So my best coaching tips. So we're going to go through some of the coaching tips based on some of the characteristics. So intensity. We have to keep parents' bandwidth in mind. So breaking it into pieces, meaning, okay, we're just going to work on bedtime. And if you're up for it, all wake-ups before midnight. And then after midnight, you just do what works. So we're just going to focus on this one piece. And sometimes if they can get a little mastery with bedtime, it helps them feel like, oh, okay, now we can do the rest of it. Because I see my kid can do it, and I can do it. Sometimes these parents are okay with just better. I don't need my kid to stop, to completely sleep through the night. I just need it to be better. I just need to call it good. And you should let them tell you if that's the case. Because these kiddos may never sleep according to targets. Getting some of them to nap during the day, impossible. So often what I'll do is I have them focus on naps while we're working on bedtime and nighttime. We'll really focus on let's really try to get naps. But if the child is sleeping well at bedtime and through the night and naps are still horrible, I sometimes just let them go in terms of just do whatever, because clearly they're not affecting bedtime and nighttime as much as we thought. I had one mom of a 10-month-old and all sleep was horrible. We got bedtime and middle of the night, all almost perfectly good. That mom worked for 2 solid weeks on nap coaching. Up one side and down the other, she worked it, and naps did not budge. And finally, we were just like, okay, forget it. This just isn't happening. And that's okay. It's really okay. These kids, napping can be its own, horrible job. So balance pushing through the pushback, which we're going to talk about, with how much stress it causes for the baby and the family. So again, the first night, parents will always say, well, how much crying could we be talking about? And I'm like, well, it could be an hour and a half. It could be maybe 2 hours at the outside. But I always say, but we want the second night to be a little bit better somehow, and the third night to be a little bit better somehow. If parents are having that much crying and that much stress a few nights in a row and literally nothing is budging, you need to take a step back, because we do not want these kids disorganized. We do not want them in that zone of hysterics ever. Just a little side note on the research on crying and little kids. Most of the research, at least on the crying it out, so the leaving the room technique, says, oh, it won't hurt anybody, doesn't hurt anybody, never been shown to hurt anybody. Well, the problem is it hasn't, in the few studies that have been done, yes, it hasn't had the effect that they particularly looked at. But not every single study looks for side effects. And also, they've never parceled it out to see whether some children do worse than others. So just because the type of research that's been done hasn't found negative effects doesn't mean that there are never negative effects. And I would say if there were negative effects to be found, it would be with this group. Because these guys can really have their circuits blown by unassisted crying. And it can, I think my theory is it could really potentially impact them. That research has never been done. So we don't know. I would just be really careful. And because it also wears on parents. To ask a parent to withstand 2 hours of crying at bedtime more than once or twice, that's a big ask. and I don't usually like to go there. So I would go very carefully and make sure that there are some improvements happening, at least in the first day or two, 2 to 3 days. Transition trouble. Oh, well, let me go back really quickly for intensity. I also tell them they can pick up to calm way faster. Because for these kids too, once they get to a certain level, parents will say, if they go past that, it's going to take me an hour to get them calmed down, even if I'm holding them. So allow parents to call it. If that child needs help calming down, help them calm down. Transition trouble. This works especially for, toddlers and up, but believe it or not, some wind down time, really helps babies too, especially for naps. So these kiddos really love patterns. They love patterns. And if we can set up a pattern that gives them some warning time, so you start turning down the lights, you start talking more quietly, maybe you play a certain song or some music to signal them that it's time to start winding down. For toddlers and up, this can be magic, floor time or special time. That's 20 minutes of 100% devoted child-led play, and it's a great thing to do after dinner and before bed. The parent gives that kid 15 to 20 minutes of undivided attention where the child is the boss. And for kind of bossy, I know how things should be 2 and 3-year-olds, it can be gold. It sort of takes some of the air out of their bossy sails for bedtime. Then they don't have to work it out at bedtime because you've just given them some time. It also is a nice transition into bedtime routine. It's also important for these kiddos. They really, remember I said they're change averse. Baby steps, and you just have to balance this. Baby steps may not work. So sometimes parents want to break it into really, really small bits. Like, okay, I'm going to coach him in the crib in our room, or I'm going to coach him in bed, and then we'll coach him in the crib in our room, and then we'll move the crib into their room. Sometimes for these kiddos, those changes, every one of them is a huge change. So you're just better off doing it all at once. But parents may know their child. Just know that sometimes baby steps don't work. On the other hand, if a child has been vigorously bounced on a ball all the way to sleep, you may need to do a few preliminary steps to get them to tolerate less vigorous bouncing, just holding. Then you start the coaching in the crib. But just know that too many baby steps for these little guys, sometimes you might as well just do it all at once. Perceptiveness, routine, and almost rigid consistency. These perceptive little guys will notice any wiggle room that you have, and they will fight for it. You cannot slip something by them. They do not understand just for tonight, because the next night you'll get, well, it was okay for last night. What's different about tonight? And you will have no good answer for that. Except for because I said so, and that doesn't work for these guys. So pick a routine and just do that. If it's 2 books, it's 2 books no matter what. And you always do it in the same sequence, and you always do it at the same time, or whatever it is that parents have picked. These little ones are great at perceiving patterns. So if you can get them to perceive the pattern, they will actually settle in kind of better. Sensory sensitivity. Ask about whether things like baths and books, things we all do as parents for bedtime, actually work for this little guy. I found a lot of times for these kids, baths actually wake them up. So just ask that question. Does a bath wake them up or calm them down? If a bath is alerting for these children, you do not want to do it before bedtime. Same with books. If you have a kid who's got this really active brain and they're very visual and they're very verbal, a story is going to be like throwing gas on the fire. Don't do a visual story if you know that your kid is going to be wanting to talk about it for the next hour. So maybe for them, start doing maybe audiobooks. For older kids, they have a lot of beautiful guided visualizations for sleep. So they're listening versus looking, using their visual skills. Always try to avoid the things that are going to wake them up. In terms of sensory sensitivity too, when a parent is helping them, a lot of times they get really intense, and a parent's impulse is to do more. And sometimes that's appropriate, but sometimes that's overstimulating. And I don't mean that in like, well, just don't do anything and let them figure it out. It's about the parent trying things and seeing what the impact is. So sometimes I say, do just one thing at a time. Maybe 2 sensory modalities is too much. Patting and shushing, 2 sensory modalities. That's touch and sound. Try just one. And eye contact is a sensory modality. So go slow. See how much works. See how little works. Parents get to become the experimenter with their own kid, and they get to learn whatever it is. Then also make sure help is helping. If I have sometimes, and I can't really explain it, parents, I wait for the parent to say this though. They'll say, it seems like me standing there and not doing what they are accustomed to is just making them mad. I always wait for the parent to say that. If the parent says, I don't feel like I'm helping by standing there, she's actually mad at me, then I say, then gently experiment with leaving the room for a second, just for a minute. I mean, you don't have to time it. You don't have to count. Just leave the room and see if anything is better. If it's not better, go right back in. But it does happen with some of these kids that you standing there and not nursing, rocking, holding, bouncing, they perceive the discrepancy and it ticks them off. For kids who are alert and engaged, like I said, watch the clock. They have terrible sleepy cues, late or non-existent. So just go for it. I have heard a weird early signal, especially in infants. I never did notice this myself, but they say that their child will get red eyebrows, and that's an early sleepy cue. Who knew? I can't explain it. Other thoughts are hang in there. Sleep coaching doesn't always go quickly or in a straight line. It sometimes can really take longer, and you'll be making progress on something, and that will tank, and the thing that wasn't working all of a sudden does, and then that stops working, and bedtime gets back on track. It's all good. It's just this chaotic kind of herky-jerky process. Hang in there and keep going, because there will be a point where it all sort of comes together. Just keep going. If it's manageable and it seems like you're still going along, it can take at least 2 weeks, if not a little bit more, for everything to kind of kick into place. Here's my best tips for parents. This is what I will tell them. Pick your battles, but fight the ones you pick. So parents do have, there can be a really common issue with jumping ship too soon. And I don't blame them. I really don't blame them, because if they're on their own, they're going to try something and they're going to go, this isn't working. I'm going to try this. Okay, that's not working either. And now I'm going to try this. So they jump ship right before something's going to kick in. So whatever intervention they choose, make sure that it's something they feel good about, and then just do that, and do it as consistently as they possibly can for, I would say, at least 3 to 4 nights, if the crying isn't like crazy intense. Whatever they've tried, they probably just haven't stuck with it, and then they're just throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. Again, understandable, but if you're going to work with them, we're going to say, look, what can you work on? And then we're going to work on that as hard as we possibly can. So once they choose what they're going to do, they have to really be able to go for it. Push through the pushback, my favorite thing to say. So anytime they change, your kid's going to notice, and especially with a baby where we can't talk to them about what's going to happen, they're going to freak out. They're going to freak out because they don't know what you expect them to do. They're like, especially if you're standing there. So they're not feeling scared. They're not feeling abandoned. If you're standing there helping them, they are then telling you, I don't have any idea what you're doing. I don't know what you expect me to do. What is this all about? So crying in that context is very different, I believe, from having to leave the room. But at a minimum, that's what kiddos are doing. They're saying, I don't know what you want me to do here. With support and consistency and encouragement, and also, I think, picking up to calm them down, we can push through those first couple of nights of them going, what the what, right? After a few nights, they will start detecting the pattern and they'll go, okay, now I'm getting the hang of this. Consistency is everything. I tell parents, like, look, I understand if the baby's been crying for an hour and a half and then you say, okay, he's clearly hungry, I'm just going to feed him, that then then that child knows. I try to say this in a way, a lot of times this gets said in a way that makes the baby sound manipulative or something. That is not it at all. If you, after a period of protest and upset, you do something, rock them to sleep, nurse them to sleep, whatever, that child then knows that nursing or rocking is somewhere on the table the next time. It's somewhere, and they just have to find it. So parents do have to try to push back all the way to the end of the first night or the first session of whatever it is they're doing. Because if they do that, I say the next night, you're not just at square one, you're at square like -10. And you're going to have to work longer to get back to square one. So there is no too long on that first night, which is always scary to tell a parent because I'm always worried. I'm like, oh God, what if it's 4 hours? So far, it's never been 4 hours. So that's good. No one's learning anything when they're hysterical, you or the child. So we want to challenge these kiddos, not blow them out of the water. And the younger the child, the lower their tolerance is for getting hysterical. We really don't want kids in that biochemical state of being crazy upset. So help them calm down. I think that's the best thing we can tell parents to do. Is that all I have? No, good. Okay, yeah. Here's the other thing. First night's going to be a rodeo. Just tell them straight out. First night's going to look like it's not working. You're going to think I'm crazy. It's going to look like it's not going to work. I call it the first pancake night. It's just going to look horrible. Don't worry about it. That's all good. The second night should be better. So sometimes when you set the parents' expectations that it's going to be bad, it really kind of helps. Like I said, I already said, crying is a change alarm. Like the crying is about the fact that you've changed something and they don't understand. And then here's what's really important. Are you as a parent, is the parent sensitive and intense too? Duh. Yes. So parents may come, and they may not even realize it, come to this process with some baggage around their own temperament. I mean, how many people were told they were too sensitive as kids? Oh my God. You were a sensitive kid and your parents did crying it out. Maybe somehow you still have memories. I don't even know. There's all kinds of stuff. Or you're just a sensitive person and crying kind of causes your whole system to activate. It's important to understand your own temperament. Elaine Aron has a new book out called The Highly Sensitive Parent. And I think it's really good because it does have some good self-calming techniques, some good abilities to you regulate yourself so that the child can also regulate. I mean, that happens, right? Children pick up on our whole being. And if we are panicky or nervous or whatever, they are going to pick up on it. And it's going to, because guess what? They're perceptive. So, right? It's a crazy cloud of ability and feelings, and we all have to try to help each other. So acknowledging your own past too, and your own sensitivities is super important because a lot of us don't even realize. Like I said, I remember the day going, why are my kids so intense? And then it was like, oh my God, I think I'm intense, right? Like I literally did not know it. And I've, in the past few years, like started to see that I'm kind of sensory sensitive and I had no idea. Your kids teach you amazing things, right? So here's my contact info, but before I do that, that was the last slide. I hope that when you come with questions, it would be super good. I didn't really talk a lot about, and I could maybe in the Q&A session, about some of the strategies by age. There's especially for 3-year-olds. I get babies and 3-year-olds as a coach, and I say 3-year-olds are drunk with power. Those are the kids who really get this full steam of their brain going, and I wonder if you all have found that as well. That 3-year-olds can be particularly challenging in terms of working with their sensitivities and their ability to wiggle themselves out of bed. All of these steps will work for all of the ages in terms of having a good pattern, having a super clear rules and limits, giving them lots of warnings about how things are going to be. For kids that can do it, I had a client recently who just suggested to have a rehearsal during the day of what bedtime's going to look like. Again, this is for like 2.5, 3 and up. Have a rehearsal. Okay, you're going to lay here and I'm going to sit in this chair and here's what's going to happen and what do you think? And practice it. And any change that you're going to do, practice it ahead of time. Give them so that you're not dealing with a tired kid who's also thrown by a change in routine. We want to front load all of the decisions that you might make so that you're not having to make decisions. The parents aren't having to make decisions on the fly because those are the worst with these kids. Okay, that was a lot. We're at 1:10. So this is my contact info, but feel free to ask questions, bring specific questions. This was a lot to cover in just a little bit of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have in the upcoming Q&A. So thanks a lot. Talk to you all soon.